capital has become mobile and can move easily in the globalized world. They can go anywhere, especially with the global financial system. Whereas workers have lost the capacity or the social technology of organizing strikes, because we have a very different production system now. We have the service sectors, we have small firms, we have a government that is no longer supporting trade unionism as a counterweight, quite to the contrary. So now we have locally stable labor and mobile capital, where long before we had the opposite. In that sense, democracy came about in the 20th century, is a productive force from the perspective of the state. It is a concession made to labor for its willingness to work. But if labor can no longer refuse to work, there's no reason to expect that there will be democracy.
Please like, share, and subscribe.
Welcome everyone to another Class Unity discussion. Today we're excited to have the opportunity to talk to Wolfgang Streeck about the crises of capitalism, the political economy of war, and the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. Wolfgang Streeck is Director Emeritus at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. In addition to being director of that institute before his retirement, he was Professor of Sociology at the University of Cologne, and before that, Professor of Sociology and Industrial Relations at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's one of the world's leading thinkers on the political economy of modern capitalism, and his many books include How Will Capitalism End? Essays on a Failing System from 2016, which was a development of a very influential 2014 article in the New Left Review with the same title, more or less. The book Buying Time, The Delayed Crisis of Democratic Capitalism from 2017. And his most recent book is Taking Back Control, States and State Systems After Globalism. And that was published in German in 2021 and then in English in 2024. And as a sort of basis for this conversation, we read the 5th chapter of that last book, the most recent book, Taking Back Control. We read the chapter that's titled A Dual Crisis 1, Capitalism, which in the book is paired with a chapter called A Dual Crisis 2, Democracy. But we just read the capitalism chapter. We also read the article Notes on the Political Economy of War from 2024, and an article titled Engels' Second Theory, Technology, Warfare, and the Growth of the State from 2020. And we'll put links to these readings in the description for anyone who's interested. So we'd like to begin by offering Professor Streeck an opportunity to open with some comments. So let me hand over to you, Wolfgang.
Yeah, I want to be short, and all I want to do is say something on the background of my own education that landed me where I am now. I studied sociology at the University of Frankfurt at the time when Theodor Adorno was still alive. I didn't quite understand the Frankfurt School, and I must say that up to now I'm still puzzled what I actually learned. Apart from the general attitude, which is that theory and the scholarly exploration of social life is something that is serious and that is to be taken seriously. It is not something that that you can do sort of in quiet moments. It involves some very unquiet insights and moments. So my original subject was industrial relations and trade unions in the and we're now talking about the 1970s, when everywhere it was the high time of social of leftist social democracy, if you want. Brand in Olaf Palme, Kreisky, Europe, and I was interested in how the post-war democracy accommodated or did not accommodate the class conflict between capital and labor institutionally and organizationally. My first projects was had to do with trying to understand the political organization of classes in capitalist democracy. Now that was already something you could have you could have spent a lifetime on. I worked then with my friend Philipp Schmitter on in the field of political science on the intermediary organizations in modern capitalist democracies, corporatism and neo-corporatism. And the prospects that politically where this had to do with. Out of this arose a general interest in institutional theory of, but in a historical institutionalist theory, not an efficiency theory, but a conflict theory of institutions generally. That sort of carried me to the University of Madison, Wisconsin, where I worked with Eric Wright and Joel Rogers, Leon Lindbergh. We had a wonderful time. I was there for 7 years when I arrived there. They had just been elected the #1 sociology department in the United States, and for all my 7 years there, I was afraid that next time they would end up #2 or #3, and then they would blame me. But so in 1995, I left to go to the Max Planck Institute for the study of societies in Cologne. That was the era when one began to see this enormous historical break, the end of the post-war democracy, and the beginning of the neoliberal era. The switch from the bilateral or bipolar world of the Cold War to the unipolar 3 decades. So as it turned out, after the end of history, so to speak, and now we're looking at the end of history. During this time, it became clear to me that without some sort of understanding of international politics or international relations or the global economy and the global polity, you could no longer do what I was happy to do, namely comparative political economy. You had to add this additional element of interdependence, large imperial structures, and all. I slowly began to realize that the problem to which Schmitter and I and others had contributed, comparative institutionalist political economy, you may call it, or comparative economic sociology, had to be thoroughly rethought in the light of the changing international situation. Also in Europe, in fact, I became very much interested in the dynamics of European integration. As you may know, that is the building of the European Union and the European Monetary Union in particular. So those of you who are younger and going into social science, you see these things hang together, and there's literally no end to it. The moment you have begun to understand something, you see that there's something else that you need to understand in order to understand what you understand, and then you go on, and you go on. So now I'm sometimes quoted by economists and of course by scientists. But the yeah the I'm sort of trying to combine a sociological and a political economy approach, and I also think that we have to switch from a system approach to a historical approach. And what I'm really trying to do is to understand how one can look at systems as historically dynamic entities where sociological or political economic theories need to be attached indices of time and place. That is to understand the uniqueness of our world in the context of something broader and larger, a theory of historical change and without a deterministic element in it. So that when the Journal of, I don't know, Social Research asked me to review my favorite book, not from my discipline, I had just read The Origin of Species, and that gave me the feeling that if you cleanse this of the reactionary biologism that people read into the book, then you have a chance to understand something about this strange thing, which is called history, that has some regularity into it, but the regularity that you can see only from now looking back. Yeah. And that's what I'm struggling with. And now we live in this period of unbelievably rapid change. Just make a thought experiment and think that that 1 year ago you might have thought you would have an American president who is doing these things, sending the National Guard into Chicago, and that's only one little snippet of all these very exciting things that are now happening literally every day. So now we're living in a time in which another great break is taking place, and the questions that you've sent me all, in one way or other, challenge our capacity to digest the daily news, as well as our capacity to combine a historical with a systematic understanding of the world as it is evolving now. And I think this is what we're going to try to explore a little further in our discussion, and I look very much forward to it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for those comments, Wolfgang. And it was interesting to hear you talk about, the history of your own work and your relationship to different disciplines. And at one point you mentioned that you're trying to combine sociology and political economy as at least part of what you're doing. And that's as an outsider to both those academic disciplines, that was interesting. It was interesting to hear that, because I immediately thought of certain passages in what we've been reading, which seem to do that, to combine them. And I think it often provides just some fascinating insights and ways of looking at things. So thanks for those comments. We thought it might be a good idea to sort of start out by focusing on the crisis of capitalism, the recent history of crises of capitalism, and then move on to talk a bit about the political economy of war, perhaps in somewhat general terms, and then to Ukraine and Gaza in a little bit. So I'd like to open by open the questions by asking you to elaborate a little bit on the account you give of the recent history of capitalism in a couple of particular respects. So in that chapter that we read from Taking Back Control, you present an account on which capitalism has faced a sequence of crises since at least the 1970s, with each crisis in the sequence lasting on the order of 10 to 15 years. There's a, for people who haven't looked at it yet, there's a very helpful table on page 91. So a couple of questions. Would you say that there's one driving force that underlies this series of crises? So, for example, a traditional Marxian view might be that there's a declining, there's a law about a declining rate of profit or a tendency of the rate of profit to decline, and that drives things. So that's one question. Do you think there's any one thing that might be seen as driving all this sequence of crises? And then a second question, it would be whether you think all the crises in the sequence as you carve things up are crises both for capital and labor, or whether some of them are crises just for the asset owning class and for speculators.
Yeah, that is absolutely goes to the core. If you read my work, you'll see that for me the role of politics and the state is important in understanding the evolution of the political economy today, and I would like to say that in my thinking, politics is extremely closely linked to the economics or the economy as described in a sort of system theoretical approach in volume one. Volume one sort of has. I'm a latecomer to Marxism. Volume one has two different strands of argument. One is at the beginning, value theory and all of this. It's basically sort of a kind of very cryptic mathematics. And the other is a historical thing about the struggle over the working day, about the print. How do you say first the accumulation? Yes.
Primitive accumulation. Yeah.
Primitive accumulation.
Yeah.
Fixing the German thing. These are the historical things, and when I got really interested in this, I was really excited about how crucial in both cases the role of the state is for the historical narrative. There's politics deeply involved in it. And I then became interested in the world system theory, where it is quite clear that the expansion of capitalism as an economic system cannot be separated from the building of global empires and national states. They are, and it's absolutely understandable because in order to expand the range of your economic activities, you need an army or a fleet that protects you as you set foot in the other world. So my crisis analysis in the book, which refers only to the years in which everything is sort of breaking apart. My crisis analysis is very much an analysis that applies a principle that I read into Marx at his best, which is where he posits that the evolution of the capitalist mode of production involves a growing socialization of the economy while the private nature of property is still being preserved. That the crisis of capitalism comes with capitalism increasingly becoming a public affair in private hands, so to speak. Yeah, depending on the public capacity of the state in order to make possible the private accumulation of capital. And this is bound to produce one crisis after the other, because these two things do not fit. Yeah. Then if you look then at the literature, you see suddenly a great number of crisis theories that basically deal with this problem. So, for example, what has greatly influenced me and influences this particular chapter that we're talking about is Jim O'Connor's work at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, about the fiscal crisis of the state. The capitalist production is becoming increasingly social production, but the resources that are being necessary for the state to make that possible remain in private hands. And that is the sort of basic nature of politics. How does the government, which acts in some way but not in all ways as the extended arm of capital, how does it extract from society the resources that are necessary and increasingly necessary to make capitalism work? Yeah. So you can also say that what one is talking about here is a tension between capitalism as an economic system and capitalism or capitalist democracy as a social system, and that is roughly like this. Capitalism is sort of a way of doing an economy. It depends on the unending accumulation of capital for the purpose of continuing the unending accumulation of capital. Yeah. Whereas, and that can happen in places but then the moment that a capitalist society begins is where such a large part of the economic activities of the society is being done in a capitalist way, so that if that process of private accumulation no longer works, then the society as a whole doesn't work anymore. So that is when modern capitalism arises. There is a moment in which the society becomes dependent on the success of its capital, and that means the success of the class that owns the means of production and the capital that is produced with it. And then you can see now comes as this forms this sort of compound of capitalism and society. Then you see where Marx does not where Marx needs to be prolonged, so to speak. He died about 1870, and what he saw in this process was sort of after the primitive accumulation, and a working class had formed that took capitalism for granted. Society had formed that took it, and then they, for this reason, they sort of began to collaborate with the accumulation process. But now we see that from then on, all sorts of other things happen, and this configuration between society and private capital sort of is transformed from step to step. And here is where Engels comes in, and where he sees that one stage in this process is the warfare state. That is where but we're going to talk about this. So no, what I mean to say is that the crisis of capitalism as we observe it now is a crisis of the relationship between private appropriation and the socialization of production, and that generates one crisis of governability after the other. And in this particular chapter, I describe how these crises evolve with a sort of a conceptual tool in the background, which is the idea of a dilemma. If the state does something to solve a crisis in this relationship now, politics does something that sort of forebodes the next crisis, because the solution the solution of now becomes the problem of the future. And that has something to do with the distributive sort of the dynamic of capitalism. You have to do something for this. For example, you have to clean up the environment in order for capitalist production to be able to continue. But if you start cleaning up the environment, then you divert capital from capital, resources from capital, as a result of which capital goes to some other place, so on and so on. And this is what I'm trying to. Before I continue are there any further questions on this?
Well, some of what you were just saying makes me think of a question that we'd sent. One of the questions we'd sent you that was going to come up a bit later, but perhaps is pertinent now, although maybe you've sort of answered it. So I'll just mention it that we are currently partway through a course on called The Capitalist State, in which we're looking at various questions about the nature of the state, including different theories of the state. And so I was originally going to ask, do you think that your story about crises of capitalism fits particularly well with any particular understanding of the nature of the state and its relation to the capital or to the capitalist class? And some of what you were just saying seems to touch quite directly on that. And one picture that is there in Capital Volume 1. In fact, I think there are some great footnotes in the chapter on the working day, chapter 10, where Marx describes that people were getting shorter because they were so malnutritioned, and so the army couldn't get soldiers who were in good shape and so on. But that you can see the government is coming in to with legislation about the working day to essentially stop the capitalist class from destroying its own central resource of labor, right? And so one picture is that, and Ralph Miliband describes this as one picture, that rather than the state as just sort of carrying out the orders of the capitalist class, you could think of it as a more sort of paternalistic relationship almost, where the state is trying to sort of make capitalism sustainable, we might almost say, to use that word in a slightly ironic way. So acting in the long-term interests of capital or capitalism rather than in the interests of particular capitalist firms, say. And so, it's just that some of the story you tell in that chapter about this sequence of crises made me think of that picture, and I wondered if that sounded right to you. But maybe you've kind of already address that, in which case we could just move on.
No, I would add something to this. The Miliband sort of sees this still as an agency relationship between capital and the state. That is in part true, but it is also that I begin to prefer a slightly different conceptual framework, which is the production of some kind of compromise between capital and workers, because capital needs labor. There's no way you can have and then as the structure of society changes, the operations that are politically necessary to generate a halfway compliant workforce in the strange operation that these people have to perform, namely to work their butts off in order for others to accumulate enormous fortunes. Now, how do you do that? And And then what you see is that, for example, in the after World War One and then after World War Two, with uh, temporarily changed distribution of power in these societies, that you can describe as a period of capitalist democracy or democratic capitalism or whatever. Governments have to find sort of a solution to the following problem. Uh, can they get workers to work for a wage that is low enough for capital to be ready to invest and high enough for workers to be ready to work and to work in the same way, in the way that capital requires, which is sort of sometimes involves not just working to rule, but some sort of enthusiasm in your work, because otherwise you can't get done what is required, and then this kind of thing historically. The way in which states supplied labor to capital basically begins with slavery, where slavery, interestingly, doesn't play such a big role in Capital Volume 1, which always surprises me. Then primitive accumulation, the change in property relationships, then the workhouse. Then in the second half of the 19th century, suddenly governments and labor begin to and capital begin to see that there's something that is a political organization process. Strikes and strike waves all over Europe. Then you see that governments have to do something in order to overcome this. And you see first sort of compromise industrial democracy, the webs in England, free collective bargaining as something that is better for capital than the direct control of labor over the means of production. Yeah, so social compromises begin. Then, interestingly, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles after the First World War, it's the first post-war settlement. What it includes is a lengthy paragraph, which hardly anyone knows, about the point that in our societies, they say, the winners of the war, there's so much injustice and there's so much conflict, and workers do not have proper representation, as a result of which all these countries agree that they have to have something like tripartite negotiations between capital, labor, and the state. Yes, it's in the treaty. Now you know that in the interwar period, this was tried somewhere, and then it broke apart, and then came fascism or whatever. But that same thing was repeated after 1945, where governments began to become mediators on the basis of the problem that workers had become so well organized that they could threaten not to come to work. That's the strike, right? They could threaten not to come to work. So they had to be motivated to come to work. You can send the police. But as Winston Churchill, sort of in the Second World War, when the Welsh miners went on strike, although they were not allowed to do so, he said, "Well, yes, we can we can send them to prison, but then we don't have coal anyway." Yeah, he says in Parliament. Therefore, they have to make concessions. So if you if you begin to see how the state sort of let's say how in changing power relations, the state becomes a force that has to mediate rather than impose. You have a very good starting point for understanding what is happening now with the entry of neoliberalism, namely that governments, rather than using the army, now use international competition in order to make workers pliant. Yeah, now they stop these tripartite consultations. They can do without trade unions because now they have something else that they can use, namely liberalization of the markets. And I think the reason why I'm saying all this is to make clear that the role of the state in the stabilization of the capitalist mode of production changes with time, and it is sensitive to the power distribution in society, where the power distribution is affected by the presence of, let's say, a social welfare state, and the non-presence or the disappearance of state. And it all has to do with the capacity of, now I'm using sort of exchange theory, if you want. In the second half of the 19th century, workers learned to stay away from the work by inventing the social technology of the strike. Yeah? Whereas industry was bound to remain in the state, in that particular state. So they had something to do. Now, capital has become mobile and can move easily. In the globalized world, they can go anywhere, especially with the global financial system. Whereas workers have lost the capacity or the social technology of organizing strikes, because we have a very different production system now. We have the service sectors, we have small firms, we have a government that is no longer supporting trade unionism as a counterweight, quite to the contrary. So now we have sort of locally stable labor and mobile capital, where long before we had the mobile capital in the sense that they could stay away, and capital that could not move. Yeah, we stop here and just say this is the perspective in which one can analyze the state. The state sort of responds to the problem of how to organize cooperation between the two, because the society now depends on capitalism, as I said at the beginning, on capitalism working. Yeah, and because otherwise that society falls apart and the state can no longer govern. Mind you that we're in the United States, I think are approaching a point where we can see that problem. Yeah, if I see the National Guard in Los Angeles, I think, yeah, well, they seem to have the feeling that they are losing control. Yeah, the state remains important not just as an agent of capital securing physical resources. It becomes the procurator, so to speak, of the willingness of workers to work. And in that sense, democracy, as it came about in the 20th century, is a productive force from the perspective of the state. It is a concession made to labor for its willingness to work. But if labor can no longer refuse to work, there's no reason to expect that there will be democracy. In this particular chapter, I say that my colleague Jens Becker has written a beautiful book on the expectation value of a system. As long as workers have the feeling that with trade unionism and political democracy, they can improve their position in this otherwise dangerous cooperation with capital. Yeah. They may be willing to play. The moment that this hope goes, there's a problem, and the government has to invent something.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's that is a theme that came through from that chapter, and it's not a happy thought, but it's a fascinating one. Thank you. I wanted to bring Daniel in to ask a question.
All right. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. This is a very fascinating discussion. We really appreciate you joining us to talk about these very important and disturbing, I guess, questions. My question for you has to do with how your view may have changed. And I don't mean this as a sort of critical question or a sort of gotcha question. But so we read your recent account of capitalism from 2024, and I was wondering, so we'd read your, some of us had read your 2014 view in How Will Capitalism End, which I find very compelling. And I was just curious how it may have changed. So some of the things that you highlight there, which I think are really important in this context to consider, this is continuing on the previous discussion as well. You suggest that capitalism's defeat of its opposition, all of its opponents, might have been a Pyrrhic victory because in some sense it came to depend on them to restrain it. And now we're sort of watching capitalism die on an overdose of itself, is the way you put it, which is a very vivid image. You then present there are at least 5 worsening disorders for which we see no cure at hand. One is declining growth, another is oligarchy, another is the starvation of the public sphere, corruption, and international anarchy. And then you suggest that what we should expect are basically intensifying frictions, fragility, and uncertainty, and more normal accidents, basically a long, protracted implosion in which there's a collapse, but without the expectation that anything else would come along and replace it. And so I was just wondering, I suspect you think most of this still holds, but I would be curious just to hear the details also, because you say that one solution to one crisis builds lays the groundwork for the next crisis.
Yeah.
What changed between 2014 and now?
Yeah. Daniel, first I allow myself to say, if you look at these 5 points in the list, I think they were pretty good list for what we're seeing now. No,
Excellent, excellent. Yes.
I mean, yes, and now I would say that I'm coming back to my initial remarks on the you can say the spontaneity and creativeness of history. Yeah, what I could not see at the point was that they had another card in their sleeves, which is the warfare state. Yeah. Now in this article that you quote, there's a steady succession of normal accidents, not necessarily, but quite possibly on the scale of the global breakdowns of the 1930s. That's what I say in the thing. Yeah, normal accidents, and now we're seeing. You can say maybe the ultimate answer to this extreme fragility is an attempt to again integrate societies in with this very proven instrument, which is international warfare. Yeah. The proxy war in Ukraine. If you look at Europe, the European Union was in an absolutely dismal condition 3 years ago. The COVID recovery program, 750 billion euros, for the first time in debt. They don't know how to repay it, and it didn't work anything. It didn't do anything. It was seen as a sort of gentle rescue of the Italian economy. There's no what you see is public debt going up, growth going down. The 700 billion didn't make any difference. Yeah. In fact, now you saw 3 years ago, you saw a European Union that was on the verge of breaking apart because there were all these exacerbating the differences in the interests of member states. Now suddenly you have a final attempt to sew this together again in this sort of around the proxy war in Ukraine. So my answer to your question would be that consider the historically proven capacity of warfare to integrate a polity and an economy. And maybe this was the last straw that they saw. Now, for example, we are hearing in Germany and in Europe generally things like the following. If we build up our arms industry, then our normal industry gets access to new technology, especially artificial intelligence, in a way that we would never have been able to get from the Americans before. Yeah. Then we're hearing promises of renewed economic growth. We're also hearing that the legitimacy crisis that is going through all these countries, where suddenly pariah parties like AfD, Le Pen, and so on, sort of rising up in all these countries. Now we may be able to either expel them as traitors or integrate them into the common front against the Russians. So my answer to this is that when I wrote this, I had a pretty good idea of what was going on, but I didn't know that this was still in the cards. Yeah, one could have thought about it, but had I said that at the time, people would have thought that's absolutely incredible. No, that can never happen. Yeah. Now we're talking about a possible war of the United States against China in the South China Sea. Yeah. And what I hear in the American discussion, I would not preclude that the United States sort of try to find a solution to its problem by going onto a major military adventure. Why is that? And why would I say that this is a possibility? And since we're going to talk about wars, that will be my introduction to the subject, so to speak. Yeah? If you look at the history of capitalism, and the capitalism is a system of continuous transformation. It is never stable. Schumpeter spoke of creative destruction, yeah, but not just in the economy, also in the political regimes. The state of the French Revolution and the state of England at the time of the French Revolution, compared to today, is something that looks really very different. Yeah, the state has grown with it and changed with it. What can we say about war and capitalism? They are inextricably linked, and all the major transformations of capitalism as a global or international, then global system, are linked to wars and great wars. The Dutch sort of took over from the Italians as the center of capitalism. Then the Brits or the English at the time so defeated the Dutch in the Dutch version, and then the center of capitalism moved to London, and it always took on new forms. New organizational forms. The British the Dutch invented the trading company. The British invented banking but the insurance banking and so on. All of these forms had to do with victorious wars where the center shifted. Then you had the shift to the United States in the first half of the 20th century. As a result of the attempt of two regional powers to escape from the sort of global order by the British, the Japanese and the Germans, trying to set up their own regional empires, out of which resulted the post-war world with the two great powers with nuclear arms having to do with the development of technology as a second story. Yeah. Then you have basically the end of the war, namely the Cold War, in 1990, where a war was avoided only because of this unique character, Mikhail Gorbachev, who basically gave in. But the idea of out-arming the Soviet Union was very much in the world. Now, in the United States, the discussion on the future New World Order, which I call the New World Order Roman II, following on the New World Order of George Bush the First in 1990. That's what it was. Now the debate is actually about the Thucydides problem, and the Thucydides problem, in short, is like this: the Greek historian Thucydides, analyzing the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, wonders why Athens, this great power, lost the war. And the answer is they saw Sparta grow, yeah, and they didn't do anything about it. They should have attacked much, much earlier, and at this point they could have won the war. Now, I sometimes read what the American strategists are discussing. Thucydides plays a very important role. And the question is, when is the right time? The last possible moment in which we can attack China and be sure that we'll win the war. Yeah. Very interesting in this context, just to say that this intertwined complex of capitalism and state power, yeah, has its own problems of reproduction. They need to. Capitalism needs the state. The big American companies need the American state as something that covers their back when they move in the world. And if that state loses power, you have to do something about it. And then the question becomes, what is the right time to make sure that the United States continue to be, as they say in their own military doctrine, the power in the world that cannot be challenged by any other power in the world. Yeah. That's on the record. That is the idea of the United States in the world. For that, they have 750 military bases abroad, not in the United States, abroad. It's a global system. And the Chinese have 2 military bases, and the Russians have 4 or 5, but the Russians are beginning to build more in Africa. Just to say that if we look at the history of capitalism, then the preparation of the ground for capitalism in its respective shape, because as I said, it changes all the time. Now it's finance capitalism and high-tech capitalism or whatever. The preparation of the territorial political ground for capitalism to function is something for governments to do, and states are the only power that can use physical violence for the purpose. And last remark on this, since 1990, there is not a single day, there has not been a single day in which the United States were not involved in some military operation somewhere on the globe. Yeah. Why should they give up on that habit in a moment in which things get really serious?
Thank
Thank
you.
you. That's sorry, Daniel. Yeah, thanks. So we were thinking that maybe what would make sense is to ask you a couple of questions that allow you to kind of extend some of the lines of thought you were just presenting a little bit further, sort of specifically on Ukraine and on Gaza. And then perhaps we could come back to questions about the political economy of war and fascism, if that sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So so yeah, first of all, and this is, I think, along lines you were starting to develop there. There's a point in the chapter we read from Taking Back Control in which you describe the war in Ukraine as a more or less exogenous crisis for capitalism. But then in other places, it seems that you want to say, well, we can leave open the question of whether this is something from outside capitalism or capitalism played a role. So I just wanted to invite any further thoughts on that question fairly specifically in the case of Ukraine. So for example, it seems clear enough that NATO expansionism played a role in bringing about the war in Ukraine, a significant role. And so one question is, was that NATO expansionism itself driven by some crisis in capitalism, or maybe just by the inherent imperatives, the inherent contradictions, if you will, of capitalism? So that's one question, is there some, can we see the conflict in Ukraine as having arisen from, at least in part or in some important part, from problems in capitalism, the state of capitalism, crises in capitalism, and then sort of to pair that with the question about Gaza, more or less the same question about Gaza, but they're perhaps framing it slightly differently. Do you think there are connections between the crisis or crises of capitalism and the situation in Gaza, or is Gaza perhaps instead a manifestation of some very particular set of, or a result of some very particular set of historical conditions and more anomalous, perhaps? Maybe that sounds like a leading question, but I really don't know what to think. So.
Briefly on Gaza and then more on Ukraine. In the historical perspective that I suggest, you have to factor in the possibility of unexpected opportunities that come up, although they are not systematically required, so to speak. Yeah, and then politicians and governments and the machineries of governments are very good at discovering accidental opportunities to do something, to learn something. The question is, what can we do with this? And the United States, for domestic political reasons, are sort of hooked to Israel, and then suddenly you see that there are certain things that you can benefit from, even from this absolutely human fanaticism that has now taken control of the Israeli state. Namely, you can deploy the most advanced individual surveillance technologies in the world. Because this population for 16 years now has no rights at all. You cannot make, you cannot even go to the loo without the American, Israeli secret police knows about it. Which raises an interesting question, incidentally, how they could not have known about all these tunnels. Yeah. So that's one thing, and I'm absolutely sure that the American General Staff or the American military is there to watch these technologies in operation for domestic or other purposes. The same now. A recent article in the New York Times about apparently the American military has a legal department which interprets humanitarian and international law and informs the general staff or the three or the four joint chiefs on what they can do, what is risky for them doing, and what they should rather not do or not let other people know. Yes, and it appears that they now have specialists in Israel watching and advising, I think, the Israeli army as they talk down the genocide theory about what they are doing, trying to collect arguments why this is not genocide, so for future uses for the American military. I'm not making this up. There was a longish article in the New York Times about 6 or 7 very sort of skilled specialists in international law, sort of basically sitting where the Israeli army is planning their operations in Gaza and over. So making use of an unexpected opportunity is something that governments like to do. Yeah, there's nobody you cannot you. For example, the one example in this article is if you starve a population, when does it begin to be genocide? And they sort of develop all sorts of reasons, excuses, and so on, that up to a certain point it is not. Now you can say that is just sort of empty words because it doesn't matter. I mean, it looks like a genocide. It is one, but it seems to be important for these people in these military apparatuses to reassure each other that they are somehow still inside the boundaries of international and humanitarian law. And this is something that you can learn there. You can learn from the Israeli military. How you dress up your operations and the language about those operations in order to evade this verdict. Yes. Now Ukraine. Now the word exogenous is probably, and I would have to read this again. It's probably misplaced. Everybody knows that from the beginning, from 1990 on, from the Clinton administration on, the question in the United States was how to, let's say, cut down Russia so that it becomes a little smaller. Yeah, and then you have all these Russian provinces around and republics and so on. Ukraine was always at the center of this, because if you look at the map, it's really big, not just in terms of population, but in territory. Kiev is about 500 miles away from Moscow. That's nothing. Yeah, and it's huge, it also controls a huge part of the Black Sea, which has been since Napoleon and even earlier a very important hotbed of European military and politics. So don't forget that Biden, as vice president in two Obama administrations, was the representative of the President of the United States for Ukrainian affairs. Yeah, he ran the Ukraine operation out of the White House as vice president. And as you know, his family was also active there. His son was sitting on the board. He is an energy specialist, sitting on the board of an energy company and collecting, I think, $50,000 a month for his operations without ever having been in Ukraine, never having set foot there. That was something, corruption, yeah, that was something that in the United States nobody bothered about, still today. Yeah, it's like whether he had pornographic pictures on his laptop is much more important than whether he was drawing $50,000 from a Ukrainian energy company. Yeah. Now, no, I think it was very clear. Then, of course, in Europe, if you look at this particular war, in Europe you see a particular problem, which is this. There are sort of small countries around Russia who have a long-term anti-Russian tradition. They also have Russian minorities, which they don't treat very well because they are afraid that they would be sort of a fourth, an eighth column or whatever you call it, inside their countries. They're very tiny countries, the Baltic countries. They cannot go to war with Russia because so they need others to do it for. And this is why they are so happy about the European Union. Now, in Europe, there's only one country that could put up the ground forces, conventional ground forces that could fight Russia, and that is Germany. The French don't have good ground forces because they have a nuclear capacity, and nukes cost a lot of money. The Germans cannot have nukes under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and because the Americans are providing them with sort of secondary nuclear capacity, they have a lot of nuclear bombs on German territory, plus 40,000 American soldiers. So Germany is not an independent country in this respect. It can, however, invest in conventional forces, and German tanks have already once been close to Moscow. Why not try again? Yeah. Now the European Union has a representative for foreign affairs, which is a woman named Kaja Kallas, nothing to do with a singer. Kaja Kallas from one of the Baltic states, and you don't believe it that she has in her younger years, when she was prime minister of her Baltic state, you see that she sort of moved up to Brussels because her home state was so small, that she had this idea that it would be a good idea to cut Russia in 4 or 5 different states. Then because then that problem would be solved forever. Now, it's hardly imagined that her army from Estonia or wherever she is from could do the job. So someone else has to do the job for her. And this is where today's tricky politics between the West European countries, Russia, East European countries, and the Baltics, and plus Finland, and the United States in the background, where this very complicated game is being played on what sort of peace settlement you can have in Ukraine, which would allow the Germans and basically the Germans to send ground troops into Ukraine as a sort of security insurance, and at the same time arm the Ukrainian army to be able to start any sort of provocation that they want, and then involve the German troops into a war with Russia. Here's the good news. Sometimes even people who we think are not very smart, when it really gets hot, they show insight. Yesterday, our new chancellor in Germany, Merz, publicly let it be known that there was no reason at all to talk about German ground troops in Ukraine because that was not an issue. That was for the first time. And I think someone had explained to him what it means to have German troops in Ukraine, and at the same time, let me say one more. I mean, these are these historical contingencies that are extremely important and that can result in major breaks in the system, so to speak. Yes, that's why I'm elaborating on them. Ukraine was in the interwar years basically divided between two factions. One was pro-Russian, the other was pro-German. Don't forget that after Germany had conquered Ukraine, there were 6 or 7 SS divisions with Ukrainians that fought on the side of the Germans. While at the same time, on the side of the Soviet Union, there were several Ukrainian divisions with Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Yeah? Whereas the Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, led by someone, a certified anti-Semite who started several, but once the Germans were there, several pogroms in several cities in Western, also anti-Polish. That's why the Poles are not exciting about the Ukrainians. Yeah. So Ukraine was always divided between these two. And right now, this sort of and one also has to say, in addition to the Ukrainians that were fighting on the side of the Soviet Union, after Stalin, the majority of the members of the Politburo were Ukrainians, including Khrushchev, who they always made jokes about because he spoke Russian with a Ukrainian accent. But he didn't care about it. That was quite normal. And mind you that Khrushchev was the commander of the ideological department, so to speak, or the propaganda department of the Red Army in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian front. Yeah? He was not just this fat guy who, no, he was a real guy. Yeah? But someone who had drawn the conclusion from the Second World War that you would not want to repeat the experience, which is a conclusion that others had not drawn. The leader of the fascist Ukrainian half, so to speak, ended his life in Munich, because after the war, the Germans pulled their friends sort of out, and there was this sort of emigre group who had fought on the side of the Germans in the Second World War. Incidentally, he lost his life because he was killed by a Russian or Soviet agent after a secret trial. They gave him a trial in Moscow, where he was sentenced to death. And then in sort of 1953 or so, he was shot. He's buried in Munich, and the Ukrainian ambassador to West Germany before and during the war, sort of went to Munich to the cemetery once a year on the day of his assassination to lay down a wreath. So
perhaps I could just follow up a tiny bit. We would like to move on to general questions about the political economy of war and talk about fascism and so on. But just to follow up a little bit for a moment on what you were just saying, it seems pertinent to bring up the debt break in Germany. Especially because it connects so nicely to the discussion in the chapter from the book, right? Because you talk there about the fact that in the wake of the failures of the neoliberal austerity measures to sort of right the ship, there was a shift towards what you nicely call, or at least your translators nicely call, the twice bastardized Keynesianism, to sort of reassure everyone that public debt is fine after all and so on. But then you sort of note that the exception was the German state that's traditionally been very concerned to the point of having a constitutional restriction on debt. But then, of course, since you wrote that, and again, this is not supposed to be a gotcha question, it's just it's a striking development, right, against the backdrop of that history, that in, I think, March of this year, my understanding is, and maybe I've got the legal situation wrong or something, but the German lawmakers voted to essentially amend the constitution, or at least to create an exception to something in the constitution about a debt ceiling. And it seems like the motivation was primarily to be able to continue to prosecute the war in Ukraine. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that before we move on, and how that fits in with the things you were just saying.
Yeah, it's something that is important in the following sense. Many things that we think are sort of cast in stone now in a crisis suddenly become contingent, and suddenly something that you would not have ever expected suddenly happens, and people just say, "Oh, well, like the National Guard in Washington D.C." Here in this case, when I think I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that I really think are a key to many things that we see is this tension between, you can also put it like this, the public cost of capitalism, of the maintenance of capitalism, and the private appropriation of surplus value. In this case, the government was certainly at the end of its capacity to provide for what capital and the allies of Germany, with their power over the German politics, what they were asking for. It was a fiscal crisis. It still exists. Now after this thing, we to our surprise, not I but others to their surprise, sort of see that the government is now fighting over another 30 billion that they have discovered are an additional deficit, which cannot even be covered from what they did when they came into office, and that's only 6 or 7 months after they came into office. The capacity, the costs of maintaining the political economic regime, political plus economic, the costs of maintaining that regime, and the resources that the public institutions can extract from the system in order to pay for this. These two are sort of moving apart. That's what you call a fiscal crisis of the state. And in situations like this, when they really are underwater, they do astonishing things. That's not only to be happy about. The astonishing thing can include going to war. I'm
sorry.
And I really urge you not to think that this is a momentary obsession. in my generation, we did comparative political economy without ever thinking about this possibility. Because somehow, without really thinking well enough, somehow we thought that this was something that was sort of out of the question, was over. Yeah? Now we're learning that this never was out of the question. We're now looking back and we're seeing that there were things that we hadn't seen. Like, for example, the military side of decolonialization after 1945 or after the Second World War, the intervention in the Suez War, the role of Israel in this context, and so on and so on and so on. We now see that it was always present, but we didn't notice it. Now we have noticed it, and we're looking forward in the other direction. And suddenly it becomes, to me, like we should not repeat that mistake. When sometimes they mean what they say. Sometimes they mean what they say. And Brzezinski and all these people in the 1990s who told the Americans that they had to go into Ukraine in order to turn it into a NATO member and a part of the American alliance. Now we are reading these things again. See, now this was not fun. They meant it. Yeah, they meant it. And the presence of Joe Biden as the attaché for Ukraine in the 8 years of Obama. Now we see it was not like he was. No, that was serious. Yeah, when the war began in 23, I think it was, or 22, 22, 23, early 23.
Yeah.
When the war began, the American High Command let it be known that in the past 8 or so years, they had been able to bring up the Ukrainian army to total compatibility with the NATO command structure. Yeah, they've been working hard. There was no accident. Now we're learning that this idiot, this madman, Putin, sort of somehow didn't like Ukrainians, and as a result, he, out of the blue, attacked them. No, that thing had a long preparation, and it was in the context of the stabilization of the new world order, which was to be unipolar, and where it was not allowed for a country like Russia, after Yeltsin had gone. The 1990s were the worst time for Russia ever. They had inflation rates, they had all sorts of things, suicides, everything, every bad indicator. And in 1999, Yeltsin sort of ran away and handed the thing over to this guy Putin, who, as a nationalist, sort of began to try to recover some sort of independence from that system because he was afraid that that system was going to suck him up.
I wanted to bring in Daniel to ask this question about fascism and political economy of war and so on. So, Daniel.
Thanks. Okay, yes. So I had a question about how you understand fascism, the concept, and how we could use the word today, because it's getting thrown around a lot, especially when people talk. They say Putin's a fascist and so forth. These sort of easy labels, which are just so convenient and opportunistic. So we have courses that we run on fascism, and then recently the political economy of war, in which we read your work. And in both, we read a lot of Mikhail Kalecki and Alfred Sohn-Rathel's writings on how capitalism can come to depend on armament production for profits that certain decisive sectors need. And we've been exploring military Keynesianism and such topics. And so your writings on Engels' ideas in the capitalist mode of destruction seem very similar. So what I want to ask you about is whether you think, how do you think we should use the word, and I guess whether the following idea seems
Yeah.
productive to you. So the impression that some of us got from reading Koletsky and from reading Sonrethel is that a common sort of idea of what fascism is wrong. And that common idea is this. Fascists are basically something like violent nationalistic bigots. They get together, they do bad things, they start wars. If that's what you mean, then we could disagree, but at least that's in the ballpark of plausibility. Maybe Putin's a fascist, maybe Trump's a fascist, maybe Orban's a fascist, and so on. Maybe Biden's a fascist. Okay. But at any rate, that definition is not adequate. They give a different definition of fascism, in which it's a political economic system in which the state guarantees profits for certain monopolistic sectors, namely weapons manufacturers and uh, adjacent types of corporations, in a way which, Mills called the privately incorporated permanent war economy. Now, if this is true, fascism never really was defeated. It never really ended. From 45 through Korea, through Vietnam, similar conflicts in former colonies, the arms race, the Cold War, right up to today's multipolar geopolitical struggles. And so, do you see any value in understanding, so redefining fascism such that it really is just a sort of system of a permanent war economy, and maybe in that sense never really ended? Or what do you think about
Yeah.
that idea?
I'm did- what's in a word? What is in a word? Um, I am hesitant to use these sort of very emotionally laden concepts. I could say so. For example, I'm in the midst of a world in which, especially in this country, which is the second supporter of Israel, and that is left in the world. Yeah, the they are discussing the question whether what is happening in Gaza is genocide or not. Yeah, my God. For those people that they are killing, that doesn't make any difference. Yeah, any difference. For me, I I function on the assumption that if it walks like a duck, if it swims like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then very probably it is a duck. Yeah, that's a sort of pragmatic pragmatic theory of terminology. Uh, the for this the fascism concept, yeah, it is like a little bit reserved in my own language for a place where you have a Führer, a charismatic individual, where you have a disciplined society that sort of lines up when the Führer comes, where you have biologistic the concepts of racial purity, where you kill people because they have a different view of what a painting is, and this sort of thing, yeah, this sort of thing. I grew up in Germany in a world in which the memory of this kind of place was very much present, and I still think it had some unique features which make it advisable to have a unique term for it. Yeah. Uh, the- as far as the permanent war economy, I I absolutely think that if you look at, I mean, Charles Wright Mills, that he was, uh, I mean, this was an incredibly good sociologist. I'm I'm really admirative of the things that he saw that other people didn't see at the time. Yeah, and I also think that incidentally, if you look back at the 1950s, then the only, and as I said, I'm not born as a Marxist. I was a sort of social democratic leftist. Um, the only people whose writings on political economy make really sense in the 1950s and 1960s, where these famous Marxists, like the American Marxists, yeah. I'm getting 80 years old, and names are always disappearing. But you know who I mean. The, these people really knew what a world is like in which you have states, in which you have capital, and in which you have militaries. Now, let me also say that uh, one of the few things that I'm really proud of, in the sense that I think I've really discovered something, is when I was asked at the such and such birthday of Friedrich Engels in Wuppertal, where he was born, to give a lecture on Engels. And then I began to read Engels. And Engels' second theory, this title was not mine. It was invented by this absolutely fantastic editor of the New Left Review, Susan Watkins, who read it, and he said, that's Engels' second theory. And the second theory, in the sense that it adds to the economic theory of development, a theory of the development of states in parallel and in interaction with the development of the capitalist economy, and there the role of arms, of warfare, of the arms industry is inextricably sort of intertwined with the development of capitalism, but not in one-way direction, in this multiple causal relationship. So, for example, one of these fascinating historical things, as we all know, the Fordist economy depends on the invention of the idea of the interchangeable parts of a machine. Yeah? And the invention was made by a man named such and such Colt, C-O-L-T, who produced the Colts for the American military in the American Civil War. So the invention of the very often very important things for the development of industry were invented for military purposes. Yeah, and one reason why the North defeated the South was that the North had access to modern manufacturing of military equipment. Yes, so what I learned, then I began to look at Engels after Marx was dead. So there is this story that Marx had asked him to contribute a chapter to Capital One on the military. And the story, Engels could write like you write, he came out of him like nothing. Now, and he refused to do this. My theory, if this is true, is that he knew that squeezed into the schematism of the Marxian theory of capitalism, it wouldn't really fit. It was not in conformity with the systemic idea, because in my view, when you talk about the war, you talk about Machiavelli. When you talk about capitalism, you talk about Marx. But Machiavelli is sort of agency, planning, politics. Marx is the logic of evolution. And squeeze these two in one, and it gets difficult. Maybe Marx would have been able to do it had he been able to write the second book after Capital, which was called The State. And then he had 3 or 4 other books, which he also wanted to write, but he got stuck in the first one, in Capital. When I looked at what Engels was doing after Marx had died, it turned out that he spent almost all of his time, apart from translating Marx and doing all these things, doing research on the weaponry of European states at the time. He had long lists of what kind of pistols the Russian army had, the British army had, the English army had. And he was positivistically absolutely fascinated with these technologies. And then he came to the conclusion, which I would cite in this article, that what he was seeing was an arms race comparable to the competitive race of national industries. And that arms race was extremely dangerous because it might get out of control. And then in the early 1880s, I think he wrote in a letter to a friend, what I see coming is a global war with about, I think, 30 million dead. And the working classes will have to fight on the side of their rulers. But after the war, when the war is over, they will rise up and in revolt, and they will bring in the socialist opposition, the socialist forces. What he had not understood was that in that war, the socialists of all countries would sort of side with their government, not with the Socialist International. In the article, I say that the reason is relatively simple, because under capitalism, you could have an economic crisis and many people would starve, many people would die. In a war, it was absolutely clear that if you lost a war, even if you won it, the sacrifice would be much, much, much bigger. Much, much more was at stake. For the Belgians to be conquered by the Germans, they would rather have a big economic crisis. Yes. And so I began to understand when I gave that lecture, which was then translated into, or which I translated into English for the New Literary Review. When I gave that lecture, it became clear to me that I would have to spend much more time thinking about this intertwinement of economic development and state development. But that assigns a role to the state, which is not just an instrument in the hands of capital. It has its own role, which the good news about this is that peace can be made between states on the basis of the separate interests of states, not just the economic interest in economic conquest. That there is something there which has a logic of its own, which could go to war, but could also go to peace, which a diplomat, and I now have sometimes to do with diplomats because I'm so interested in this, they explain this to you. Yeah, because you have to forget everything else and then look at the interests of states. And one saying that I learned from this is that the moment in a negotiation sometimes mentions that the other side is wrong and we are right, the negotiation is over. Yeah, morally wrong, you can't do this. What you can do is you can talk about interest and then see whether you can align these interests in a way that excludes warfare. That's something that Engels didn't know yet, or something that he thought was improbable because he thought technology-driven arms races will finally end in the war that then actually came.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. We've run a little longer than we said we would already, and there are so many more questions we'd love to ask you, as you know. But we've had lots of your time, and we're extremely grateful to you for taking the time. We would love to talk to you again sometime about other topics, perhaps about the state of the left and the current political moment, and perhaps invite you to play the prediction game a little bit. But anyway, thank you so much. That aside, thank you so much for making the time today. And on behalf of all the members of Class Unity, we're very grateful, and we were honored that you would join us. So thank you so much.